The intention was simply to hate the entire world, as long as that hatred was not directed at the Japanese. Such was the situation before Indonesia Merdeka became a fact. This quote by Sutan Sjahrir was shared by Henk Muller. He says, "So Sjahrir wrote in his essay titled Our Struggle in October 1945, 2 months after the proclamation of Sukarno and Hatta. Sjahrir became the first Prime Minister of Indonesia. He encountered a lot of opposition from radical groups. His perspective is revealing. Sjahrir regarded the murderers and robberies of Indonesian youth as fascist." Our Struggle by Sutan Sjahrir. Expressions of mass unrest, which often take the form of cruelties and violent assaults on property, can readily be understood if we look for the deeper causes. During the 3.5 years of the Japanese occupation, the foundations of village society were disrupted and overthrown by forced labor, by the impressment of villagers to serve as romusha for the Japanese, slave laborers far from home, or as soldiers by the compulsory delivery of some crops and the forced planting of others, and by an unlimited arbitrary despotism. In the towns, too, the uncertainty of their position stirred deep unrest among the masses. Thousands who earned their living as workers before the arrival of the Japanese have lost their livelihood. Tens of thousands of peasants fled to the cities to escape tyranny and famine in the villages. Tens of thousands more fugitives from the romusha, hai-ho, or other forms of forced labor were added to the throngs in our cities who had no sure means of earning a living. All this caused a steadily rising tension in our society. The danger of this exploding in an uprising and in widespread disorders increasingly threatened the Japanese. When Japan collapsed and the Japanese prepared for surrender, their government's authority became extremely weak, and the danger of a massive explosion of the accumulated tension in our society grew still more grave. To escape this threat, the Japanese resorted to all kinds of stratagems, including attempts to divert popular unrest against other groups. By propaganda and agitation, they tried to deflect the deep and growing hatred they aroused against the whites, against the Chinese, and against the Pangarep Praja. It cannot be denied that this propaganda campaign was very influential and benefited the Japanese considerably. For 3.5 years, Indonesia was completely sealed off from the outside world, so that we knew nothing of developments abroad. And the Japanese had no difficulty in selling the lies which formed the basis of their propaganda. When the hatred of our people for the Japanese had become universal and had in some places even caused disorders, they manipulated our nationalist feelings to cool down our burning hatred for them. They formed a younger generation to heighten nationalist agitation and so to avert the internal social dangers which threatened them. And certainly this nationalist agitation gave deep satisfaction to our youth and intellectuals, who were in a general state of unrest and irresolution. Japanese secret societies like the Black Dragon, the Black Fan, and other creatures of the Japanese Fifth Column, the Kampatai and the Kaigun, directed most of their energies towards our youth, not without success. Although on the surface our youth generally loathed the Japanese, many were unconsciously influenced by Japanese propaganda, so that their behavior and way of thinking often followed the Japanese model. This psychological influence was manifested most clearly in hatred of foreigners, particularly those whom the Japanese denounced as our enemies. The Allies, the Dutch, the Eurasians, our own countrymen, the Ambonese, the Menadonese, these too are fellow countrymen, the Chinese and the Pangarep Praja. In other words, our youth were permitted to hate the whole world so long as they did not direct their hate towards the Japanese. Such was the situation before the declaration of Indonesian independence, and such, accordingly, were the materials at hand for building the dwelling place of Indonesian freedom. When the Free State of Indonesia was set up, most of the men who controlled it were former employees and assistants of the Japanese. This has proved an obstacle to purging our society of the Japanese disease, so dangerous for the moral health of our youth. Political education, which even in Dutch colonial times was superficial enough, virtually ceased to exist in the Japanese period. Our youth were psychologically conditioned simply to take orders, to bow down and to deify their superiors, just as the Japanese themselves bowed down to and defying their emperor. Thus, our young people learned merely to bow down to and defying their leaders. They were never taught, and so did not develop the ability to act with a sense of individual responsibility. Real revolutionary consciousness, which must be based on a solid understanding of society, was naturally very rare. Accordingly, the ability to organize and make use of the potentialities existing in our society was scarcely developed at all. Thus, the weapons and instrument of our struggle, which could and should have been forged from the social force inherent in hatred for Japanese oppression and exploitation, remained unforged. The pervasive unrest in our society was channeled by our youth into hatred for the foreigners living in our midst. Marching about with bamboo spears spread and had now turned into robbery, murder, and other acts which either have no meaning for our democratic struggle or are reactionary, as indeed all fascist acts are ipso facto irremediably reactionary. The delayed arrival of the Allies to replace the Japanese army, which had lost the will to rule, actually offered the government of the Indonesian Republic an excellent opportunity to gather strength. But this has never been adequately accomplished. In the first place, this is because the people in control of the Republican government are men without real character. Most of them are far too accustomed to kowtow to and run errands for the Dutch and Japanese. Psychologically, they are irresolute and have proved quite incapable of acting decisively and assuming responsibility. Secondly, many of them still feel morally obliged to the Japanese, who bestowed on them an opportunity to prepare Indonesian independence. In their own eyes, they have become the government because they work together with the Japanese. It was for these reasons that when the power of the Japanese weakened and finally collapsed, and yet had still not been replaced by Allied military power, the Republic of Indonesia was unable to build up our nation's strength. The result was that we were a state and a nation without a government. The masses, in their uncertainty, were given no education or clear understanding of how to solve the problems of government administration. Thus was born the chaos, which is now spreading contagiously everywhere. In this atmosphere, nationalist agitation has had consequences which the nationalist agitators themselves neither wished for nor could control. Looting and murdering of foreigners, while quite understandable from the standpoint of the situation of the masses, nonetheless exposed the naked weakness of the government of the Republic, which felt itself to be neither regarded nor respected by the people. Our youth, who were trying to make use of popular unrest, also completely lacked the necessary qualifications for leading the people's struggle in the proper way. Generally speaking, their skills were simply those of the common soldier, marching, obeying orders, conducting field offensives, and suicide assaults. They had never been taught to lead. Inevitably, therefore, since they knew no better, their methods of agitation and propaganda among the masses were those they had seen and learned from the Japanese. In other words, the methods of fascism. The present psychological condition of our youth is deeply tragic. In spite of their burning enthusiasm, they are full of confusion and indecision because they have no understanding of the potentialities and perspectives of the struggle they are waging. Thus, their vision is necessarily very limited. Many of them simply cling to the slogan, freedom or death. Whenever they sense that freedom is still far from certain, and yet they themselves have not faced death, they are seized with doubt and hesitation. The remedy for these doubts is generally sought in constant, uninterrupted action. Action thus becomes a psychological opiate. For our nation, our youth's intoxication with action is actually an inestimable advantage. Their activism has been a powerful stimulus to our struggle at its beginning. Nevertheless, through lack of understanding, many of their actions have missed the mark and have undermined and damaged our cause. For example, agitation and violence against foreigners have seriously weakened the moral standing of our struggle in the eyes of the outside world. The outside world was initially quite sympathetic to our hope of building a nation of our own. In fact, it can be said that at first, world opinion was generally on our side, especially the world labor movement. But with the growing number of incidents such as looting and murder, which indicate the spread of anarchy among our people, and which can scarcely be regarded as legitimate expressions of our struggle for freedom, international sentiment towards our cause has begun to change, as the events of the last few weeks have showed. In general, every sign of anarchy in our country disappoints, not only the capitalists, but also the workers of the world. The capitalists are disappointed in their hopes of profitable capital investment once security is established in our country. The workers are disappointed at evidences of fascist cruelty, which is now so notorious throughout the world. It is hard for them to swallow murders of foreigners, let alone murders of Eurasians, Manadonese, and Ambonese, who are our fellow countrymen. They will interpret these cruelties as signs of the immaturity of our nationalist feelings, which should properly contain a solid core of nationalist political consciousness. Hatred for Eurasians, Ambonese, and Manadonese can only be understood by the outside world as proof that a genuine national consciousness among the masses of our people is either still very superficial or simply does not exist at all. So long as the people from one region can be played off against people from other regions, it will be very difficult for the world to accept the reality of an Indonesian national consciousness among our people, and our present struggle will also be completely misunderstood. Revolution and purge. If our struggle is to be carried out in the environment just described, it is clear that our revolution must be led by revolutionary democrats, not by nationalist groups who have kowtowed to the fascists, whether Dutch colonial or Japanese military fascists. This democratic revolutionary struggle must begin by purging itself of the stains of Japanese fascism and curbing the views of those whose minds are still under the influence of Japanese propaganda and indoctrination. Those who have sold their souls and their honor to the Japanese fascists must be eliminated from the leadership of our revolution. Those who have worked in the Japanese propaganda organizations, the secret police, and the Japanese fifth column in general. These men must be regarded as traitors to our struggle and must be sharply distinguished from ordinary people who worked for the Japanese simply to earn their daily bread. Thus, all such political collaborators with the Japanese fascists must be regarded as fascists themselves, or as the running dogs and henchmen of the Japanese fascists, who, it goes without saying, are guilty of betraying the people's struggles and the people's revolution. The Indonesian Republican state, which we have made the instrument of our people's revolution, must also be made the instrument of our democratic struggle, purged of all traces of Japanese fascism. The present constitution, which is still far from fully democratic, must be replaced by a wholly democratic constitution, which will imprint on every organ of state administration the fundamental rights of the people, freedom of thought, speech and religion, freedom to write, to earn a living, to have an education, and to share in determining the organization and the business of the state through the right to elect and be elected to all bodies which participate in governing the country. Struggling for the content of freedom. The Indonesian Republican state, which we are struggling to make an instrument of our democratic revolution, will only achieve its fullest value if we imbue it with a genuine democratic character. For us, only a victory of this kind would be a victory with real meaning and content, not simply a victory of reputation and honor. It is this real content of freedom that must now guide our political struggle. For the nationalist struggle rarely escapes completely the danger of being too influenced by names and forms. It frequently turns out that a so-called national victory is, in practice, without meaning for the masses of the people. If we determine the value of Indonesia's freedom by its genuinely democratic quality, then in our political struggle vis-à-vis the outside world, it is for this inner content that we must strive. The state of the Republic of Indonesia is only a name we give to whatever content we intend and hope to provide. Hatred of foreigners. One of the most important aspects of our struggle is our attitude and policy towards various groups who are more or less isolated from the rest of our citizens. Foreigners, Europeans and Asians of mixed descent, Christians, Ambonese, Menadonese, and so forth. As of now, we still do not have a satisfactory attitude and policy towards all these groups. Recently, indeed, many acts have been performed which are clearly wrong and do grave harm to our democratic struggle. Hatred for alien groups and people is a hidden facet of every nationalist movement, especially when these aliens occupy a visibly privileged position. But every nationalist movement which intoxicates itself with xenophobia in order to compound its own strength will undoubtedly, in the long run, be confronted by the whole world and all mankind. This kind of nationalist frenzy may at first represent a certain strength, but in the end, it must reach an impasse and finally choke itself to death in a spirit of jibaku. The strength that we must seek lies in a spirit of sacrifice and a feeling for justice and humanity. For only a nationalist spirit, sustained by a feeling for justice and humanity, can lead us forward within the context of world history. Ultimately, all nationalities will inevitably come to an end in a human fellowship, which will envelop the whole world and form it into a single nation of mankind, whose relationships will be based on justice and truth, no longer limited by narrow sentiments, which cut man off from man through difference of skin color or ancestral descent. Only when these narrow sentiments cease to be the main impulse behind our actions and behavior will the bands fall off which have blinded us to the barbarousness of our history. Only then shall we be able to understand clearly the difference between love of our country and hatred for foreigners, or hatred for groups of our own countrymen, who through accidents of history have either been isolated or have isolated themselves from the rest because of differences of blood. Stupid and barbarous as this idea of blood is, our attitude towards this question must be based on a profoundly social perspective, honest analysis and rational calculation, in the service of the cause of humanity and social justice. It is very plain that the younger generation, especially the students, who are now burning with patriotic ardor, will not be able to perform their pioneering tasks if this nationalist spirit is not suffused with a real feeling of democracy and social responsibility. Without this, it will find itself in the impasse which ultimately confronts all nationalisms. The time will come when the people will no longer follow, and may even resist. In time, our youth will learn from experience that it is not the soldier who will make our revolution triumph, but the masses of the people the workers and the peasants, together with the intellectuals and the younger generation. The moment has come for our young people to broaden their vision of the foundations of our society. They must now realize that the real strength of our struggle lies not with them, but with the masses, especially the organized workers, who have a keen awareness and understanding of the worldwide struggle of the working class. We must draw a clear and sharp line between these objective requirements and the spirit of our democratic revolution, so that we never destroy our revolution and its spirit by straying into militarism and fascism.